Today I'll be kind of getting into, like I said, I'm going to talk about more, about the Greek city-states, like the rise of them and all that, which kind of peak in the fifth to fourth centuries overall. But like I said, the thing I'll get into today is I'll emphasize the greco-persian wars, which are called all kinds of names. Of course, Persian wars, I think, is the shorter name, but they sometimes call them also as well, which is a major event. I think one of the two biggest wars that really occurred in ancient Greece, that and the Peloponnesian War, which kind of had a negative effect on Greece later, which I'll probably get into that too a little today. I should have time as well. I think from last lecture, I was kind of getting into, I was talking about the rise of Athens and, of course, the rise of Sparta, which, those two end up in the Greco-Persian Wars, like on the same side, fighting, of course, against the Persians. Of course, I'll get into that. I think we were kind of just trying to start getting into that, of course, topic more or less about that. And the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, took place in the early 5th century. Pretty much they start close to about 500 and go down to about 450 BC. You can see they broke out in the Aegean basin because of the fact that the Persian Empire, like they said, was trying to expand into the Aegean world overall. And so this was a major conflict. In fact, one of the first major conflicts that took place between East and West. I know you had like the Trojan War, which may or may not have happened, where you had people in Asia, like in Turkey, fighting, of course, the Greeks in Greece, like the Mycenaean culture, but they're not sure if that was actually a real war or not. It's kind of debated about that. Of course, the Greco-Persian Wars has all kinds of names. Some people call it, Greco-Persian Wars, the Greek-Persian Wars, or simply just people call it the Persian Wars as well. I'll get into Herodotus later, but Herodotus, was one of the main historians that wrote about the Persian Wars between the Greeks and the Persians, and so I'll kind of mention him a little later because he's where we get a lot of our historical information about those wars. Now, whether it's accurate or not, they're not sure about that, though. So the video did talk about the fact that King Darius, or Darius, as they say it, of course, also as well, was the king, of course, that really initiated the wars. He was the king that you can see it reigned from the end of the 6th century to about the early 5th century BC, 522 to 486, you can see. And it's under him that the empire of the Persians began pushing more east and west. They go into India at one point, like all the way to the Indus River Basin. They push into Egypt, and then they also cross the Hellespont, the Dardanelles region, close to Turkey and Greece. They push into like Thrace and northern Greece. So this kind of had an effect on the Greek world, like their trade routes. I know I think the Greeks had been trading with the Egyptians. So this kind of created a real big problem between both sides, more or less. Oh, I do have a map. Here's a picture, of course, of King Darius the Great, of course. Probably one of the 3 greatest kings of Persia. Xerxes the Great, of course, also his, of course, son that would be later. And then, of course, originally the one we talked about a long time ago, Cyrus the Great, of course, who founded it a long time ago. But there you go. You've got, of course, the map of the Persian Empire overall. Yeah, you can see how large it was. You can see that the Persian Empire was probably something like 40, 50 times larger than the Greek world. It's a miracle that the Persians didn't destroy the Greeks. They just wipe them out because it's such a massive state that was there at the time. So, that empire was at one point stretched into like 3 continents, Western Asia, North Africa, and Egypt, and then into part of Europe right there. So you can see like the map showing you the areas where Cyrus conquered, Cyrus the Great, and then Darius the Great, of course, all the areas that he took over all the way to the Indus River Valley, you can see in the east right there. Let me get into and talk about also, like, what really caused the war to break out. Well, if you study about the Persian Wars and all that, It was because of the fact that the Greeks began pushing into Western Turkey, an area they call Ionia. Ionia was an area that the Greeks had colonized. I think most of the Athenians were the ones that had sponsored a lot of the settling of that area. If you go back to that map right there, I can kind of blow it up for you, but Ionia is that area you can see on the southwestern coast of Turkey. It's about right here. You can see Miletus was a Greek city-state, which was one of their major states that was there. Well, the Persians under Cyrus the Great had taken over Lydia, where Sardis was the original capital of it, then a Persian city then. And then so they were basically being forced to being ruled by the Persians, having to pay Persian taxes and things like that. And of course, the Greeks didn't want to be under their rule. They wanted to have more independence, which a lot of the Greeks, favored. And so eventually what happened was close to about 499, the Ionian peoples like Miletus, that city-state I told you about, revolted against the Persians under King Darius the Great. And so that's what caused the whole conflict to start, because Darius wanted to basically get back, of course, at the Greeks. Apparently, what caused the whole thing to kind of blow up into a wider, bigger war was the Athenians then sent their forces across the Aegean basin, like with a fleet. And they attacked Sardis, which was one of their capitals in Turkey, of the Persians, sacked that city. And so that caused, to want the Persians to want to invade Greece with multiple invasions, which there's at least two major invasions of Greece you can see there that they have. 490, of course, the one attempted by Darius the Great, and then the one in 480 BC, the one that's more famous, the one by Xerxes the Great, and the son of Darius. So we'll talk about, of course, both of those today. Overall. Of course, I did want to mention before I get going with some of the conflicts that really went into the, Persian wars. I did want to talk about Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Of course, I think we've talked about him numerous times already. Herodotus is the oldest source on the Persian wars. There are some other writers that write about it too, as well, but he's the one that's the most famous. His books, which are called different names, Histories of Herodotus, of course, is one of the names they usually called it, but they also called it the History of the Persian Wars. They have that name that they dub it as well. And his book was published about mid-5th century BC, and it's not exactly a scientific historical work. It's based off of, I guess, eyewitness accounts maybe, but I guess from whatever accounts he could, gather about what happened on the war. But some of his accounts are kind of exaggerated, or there's been even some debates about whether Herodotus may have made up some of his stories as well. Some people call him the father of lies. You've probably heard of that before, or may have talked about it before. I think Voltaire, who was a famous French writer in the 18th century, called him the father of lies, because he may have made up stories. Whatever, but most of our sources about the battles, Battle of Thermopylae, Battle of Marathon, Battle of Salamis, those you may have heard of, were gotten mostly from his sources, of course. So Herodotus, of course. But we'll get to Thucydides a little later. Thucydides is really considered the first scientific historian, because he really uses all, sources, viable sources, I guess. And a lot of these historians don't quote their sources. Like there's no citations or anything like people have to do today, students or whatever, or historical writers. Okay, so let me get more into, of course, what happened was Darius eventually would invade or try to invade Greece in 490. He sent this invasion force that they talked about in that little short, brief video clip, with a naval fleet and, of course, an army, which I think was maybe close to 30,000 troops, I think is how large his army was, that he brought over, infantry and some cavalry. And it was led by two men. I think they said Datis was one of them, who was one of his generals, who I guess was like in Western Turkey. There was a commander there. Oh, and Hippias. They talked about Hippias a little bit too. Hippias was that tyrant that the Athenians threw out because the tyrants had ruled. He was the one of the sons of Pisistratus that had ruled. He wanted to get his power back, and so that's why the Persians were going to come in there. But they also wanted to take over Greece. I think was the primary reason why he was really into it. And so they landed near what is Marathon. Marathon is this little city, which they've got a really good map showing it. But I do have the map of the battlefield showing it right here. Bottom right, you can see it's at the kind of on the eastern end of the, it's right down here, but you can see the eastern part of the Attica Peninsula, which is right here. He was going to land his forces there, and then what they were going to do, they were going to cross the peninsula and attack Athens from behind, instead of, I guess, from the sea on this side. And they thought that was a good plan. And then it's named after some kind of bay, that's right here, called the Bay of Marathon. And they also got a city here nearby, city-state, I guess, called Marathon, hence the name. Now, I'm sure you've heard the fact that the battle is, it's where they get the marathon run from, that competition where you run, 26 miles or whatever. And so we'll talk about that. That's something that's very famous, about the battle, is the so-called marathon run and the origin of it. Well, if you know about the battle, the Greeks were heavily outnumbered. I believe it was like 2 states put up forces. I know it was like the Athenians was on one side that was there. They had another state called Plataea. Yeah, Plataea was the other state that also put up forces. They numbered like about 10,000 hoplites in the battle. And then they think that the Persians had like probably 3 times more forces, like maybe 30,000 troops. And so if you know what happened, the Greeks sent like a messenger. I'll get to Phidippides later. He was a famous messenger associated with the Battle of Marathon. He was sent to Sparta to get help from them, the Spartans and all that. The Spartans, they weren't able to send forces till later, till after the battle was over. And so by the time they got there, they pretty much, it was pretty much done. And so, however, there was a lot of generals there that were not. If you know about the Greeks call out general a strategos. So they call it general, commander of like forces. And evidently there were like 10 of them there. They couldn't decide what to do. Well, they had this general named Miltiades. He basically eventually came up with an idea, which was like a flank attack to flank the Persians on the left and the right, because the Persians had more of their forces in the center. And so this envelopment on their flanks was a major reason why the Greeks would win at Marathon. And it caused the Persians to panic when their first forces got kind of encircled. And so most of their forces actually fled back to the ships. I think if you go back to that little clip I showed you showing the battle, the actual battle, you can see that there. You can see when the Greek forces came up, they put more forces on the left and right flanks, causing encirclement somewhat there. Somewhat of an envelopment of their forces. And then you can see they fled back to their ships. And apparently, according to Herodotus, the casualties for Marathon were lopsided. Like the Persians suffered very high casualties. I'll put it up on the screen again, but 6,400 Persians were supposedly killed and wounded. The Greeks was 192. Now, whether that's really accurate, I don't know. But some claim it is, that it was that lopsided of a battle. They do think that part of why the Greeks were also successful was the fact that the Greek phalanx was superior to anything the Persians had, and their weapons were better. The Greeks had better weapon technology. Like their spears were longer, I think, and better. I think their armor, I know, their shields were a lot stronger than what the Persians were using. They say that the Persians weren't able to use their cavalry. They weren't able to bring them up in time, and so that kind of played a role in why basically the Greeks eventually won the battle. Also, if you know about the marathon battle, it's famous for the so-called marathon run of Phidippides, who's, by the way, called different names. They sometimes call him Philippides. There's another version of the name. Like Herodotus mentions the name as Phidippides, and then there's another writer later named Lucian, writing in Roman times, who calls him Philippides, like a little different version of the. I think there's another one too. I think there's 3 different versions of the name. You got to wonder if he's a real person or not. Might be more mythology. But supposedly, according to, I think, more Lucian than Herodotus, he talks about how Phidippides ran from basically Marathon to Athens after the Greeks won the battle to tell them basically that they'd won, because everybody wanted to know what was going on. And anyway, he told them Nikamen, which meant basically we won. And of course, the legend is that after he told him, he dropped dead from running 26 miles, the first marathon, I guess. So exhaustion. So later, of course, they're going to make it into like a actual sport, which will kind of start at the 1896 Olympics, but it was never used during like the Greek Olympics. Like there was never a marathon or anything like that, but it's where they get the name from and all that, of course, later. So it's an interesting story about the marathon and where it came from. All right, now of course, what happened with marathon? Well, basically Darius's forces went back home. After that, the whole first invasion was a total failure, pretty much, and you'll have a second invasion later that's going to occur by Xerxes, which of course will be in 480 BC, and so that's the one I want to get into today, which of course is really more well known about that, which I'll get to. So yeah, you've got this deal, the so-called second invasion that comes in that I'll kind of talk about, which was really more planned better, and it was more, they put more forces into it, obviously. And according to what they think today, Xerxes amassed a huge force, including an army and, of course, a naval armada to basically invade Greece. But this time he was going to go by land instead of crossing the Aegean, landing on the coast there. And there's different theories on how many troops that Xerxes had in the second invasion. The second invasion was like 480 to 479 BC, and I believe Herodotus claimed it was 2 million troops, like some godly amount that they may have amassed, but they don't think it's that many. They think maybe 250,000 seems to be the amount maybe that he amassed as a force. I think when Alexander the Great fought the Persians, it was kind of like similar, comparable to that. Likely, it would probably be impossible to have that many troops, like 1 million or 2 million men, to try to go into Greece. And I think if they had that many, they would have definitely been overwhelmed for sure. And like I said, Xerxes' forces invaded through they went through northern Greece, is like where they went into. And I do have a map. I'm trying to think if I have a map showing you that. I can show you like a map of kind of the route that he took to get into Europe. But basically, he would cross what is called the Hellespont, which is about right here. It's the so-called Dardanelles Strait, as they call it also. It's about right here, probably about right here where it crossed. It's one of the narrowest straits, just about a mile wide. It's about how it is. The Dardanelles Strait is a strait that runs between Turkey and the European Greek side that goes up into the Black Sea. It's like right below where the Sea of Mara is and where Constantinople or Istanbul is, which will be later, of course. Hey, Chris, come on in. So it's about right there where it is. And Anyway, if you know the story about this, Xerxes built a bridge across it. He did. He bridged it. So I don't know if anybody had ever done that before. And it was a pontoon bridge where he took a bunch of ships and he built like a bridge over them. And Herodotus tells this kind of story where he claimed that the first bridge they built collapsed. It didn't work. The engineers, I guess, messed up on it. And Herodotus made this, I don't know, it's kind of maybe a made up story, I think. But he claimed that what happened was that Xerxes had a bunch of men get out in the water and whip the water with whips to get the water to, basically, I guess, allow the bridge to be built across. And so he built the second one, and then they were able to cross it after that. So I don't know if I believe that story, but it's one of those stories that Herodotus mentions. That's pretty amazing engineering feat, though. 1 mile, I think, is about how long that was. But so yeah, the Persians then invaded up through northern Greece, like coming down through Thrace, Macedonia, where Alexander the Great will be later, and all that. And so the Greeks are kind of forced to kind of ally themselves in like a military style alliance, together, usually called a league. And so that's what brings in Sparta and Athens together and some of these other city-states to pool their forces, their resources, their naval ships to fight against the Persians. Otherwise, they would have been conquered, and been slaves of the Persians. So that would have been the end of Athenian democracy, etc. So what the Greeks came up with was this idea to block like Thermopylae Pass in the north, like above Boeotia, the Artemisium Strait, which is like above Euboea, the island of Euboea. And so they sent like armed and naval forces up there to kind of slow down Xerxes' invasion, because they were hoping to like evacuate everybody that was in the south, like in Boeotia, Attica, and all that. Bring up also forces from Attica, the Peloponnesus Peninsula, to basically fight, and maybe hopefully stop the invasion and all that. They weren't really sure how many forces he had, Xerxes and stuff like that. So, and so that's what led to some of those battles you've heard about, like, the Battle of Thermopylae. Of course, that's well known in Persian history. Here's a map showing you, by the way, kind of the route that Xerxes' forces is coming down. Like, so he's coming down the east coast of Greece. Here you can see right there. Also, his navy's over here too, coming down the coast as well at the same time. Kind of, supplying his forces, and without the Persian navy, the Persians wouldn't be as good. You can see where Thermopylae Pass is, which is right here. You can blow the map up to show you better the location of it. But Thermopylae Pass is an important pass and road that runs down into Boeotia, which is right here, this area right here. And it's a very narrow pass. If you know about this, like in ancient times, hard to get like huge armies in there. The name Thermopylae, by the way, means hot gates, because there was like a nearby hot springs that people would sometimes bathe in, or maybe still bathe in today. And so Xerxes was going to have to fit his huge army through this pass if he wanted to try to attack like Thebes and Athens, which are down here, and maybe get to the Peloponnese Peninsula, which is over here down below. So what happened was the Greeks sent a force there to try to stop, Xerxes' forces, which they think was about 7,000 troops, by the way. And it was like multiple states that were involved. And I think Sparta, of course, put up, was one state that was involved. Also, Thebes and Thespia was the other states that put up, I think, the bulk of the forces that actually fought with the Spartans, which had like 300 men, about that, the so-called 300 Spartans you've heard about. They were led by King Leonidas, who was the famous king of Sparta, probably one of the greatest kings in history. And so they were brought there to try to block, Xerxes' forces, from coming through the pass. And so that led to the Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BC, which, by the way, was a 3-day battle. That was how long it took place. I don't know if they know the exact dates on it, but sometime in August in the summer of 480 BC. And they were vastly outnumbered. I'm not sure they're not sure about that, but it was some crazy number. Some claim there was like 200-something thousand troops trying to break through, and they had only 7,000. So yeah, those are the states. Yeah. So Sparta put up some, of course, under, of course, Leonidas. And then I told you Thebes and Thespia. Those were states that were nearby, mostly in what is Boeotia, of course, that put up forces that fought. Why was it a 3-day battle? Why couldn't they just annihilate them in one day? Because, they had a huge army and all that. Well, it was a narrow pass. I told you again, very, very narrow. I think they even show some paintings or pictures where it's so narrow that only a few guys can get in there at a time, like soldiers or whatever. I don't know if it was that narrow, but it was so narrow. And then the fact that the Greeks had just superior forces militarily, like the Spartans and other Greeks just had better armor, better military techniques, like the so-called phalanx. And so the Persians suffered huge casualties in like the first 2 days. I think Herodotus claims they took something like almost 20,000 killed and wounded on the first 2 days of the battle, which is amazing. I think the Greeks had suffered like 4,000 or 5,000 killed and wounded in the whole battle, which is amazing compared to how many they had, total. Why did the Greeks lose in the end? Well, there was this Greek trader. I don't know if you know about it. His name was Ephialtes, who basically went over to the Persian side, and he told them about this, I think it's a goat path that went around the backside of the mountains that went to the other side, or east pass of Thermopylae Pass. Well, I guess some money. And the name Ephialtes, supposedly in Greek now, means nightmare, because it became a nightmare for the Greeks and Leonidas that were trying to guard the pass. And so with that, the Persians were able to outflank the Greeks, get on both sides of the pass, and basically destroy them. And so what Leonidas did, if you know about that, he evacuated most of his forces and left a rear guard to try to block them and harass them. I want to say 1,500 men. I think it's kind of a debate, or maybe it was 2,000. It's kind of a debate about how many men were left behind. But the rest of the Greek forces, including the Spartans, were all wiped out. And so Sparta is known as like a last stand battle. It's kind of like the Greeks' version of Custer's Last Stand, like in American history, if you want to compare it to that. And after they killed Leonidas, they cut his head off and they put it on a pike, if you know about that. But they say that the Persians were demoralized. It was kind of like this so-called Pyrrhic victory. They won the battle, but they took so many casualties that they felt like they lost the battle, and so, but it did allow Xerxes to eventually, come down the pass, and of course sack, Boeotia and Attica, of course, which would happen. So Athens, Thebes, would eventually be sacked and burned, including Athens' Acropolis, which is behind me, would get burned by them. Here's some more pictures, by the way, showing you, of course, there's Xerxes, of course, right there. Of course, there's a famous statue that they later put, by the way, at the site of where Thermopylae, the battle took place. You can see right there. And there's actually a, like kind of a motto or saying that they put on it, or quote, that was from King Leonidas. And it said, basically, come and get them. I don't know if you know the story about this, but the Persians at first told them they couldn't believe they were going to fight. 7,000 men? Crazy. They thought, they'd just give up and put down their arms. And so when they asked him to put down their arms, he said, basically, come and get them, was the famous reply, if you know about that. Here's, by the way, the actual site, I believe today, where they fought. So it's kind of like the eastern part of Greece, kind of like that northern part of Boeotia. I think it's close to the sea. It's like to the sea to the east of where that highway is kind of running to the right there. That's supposedly the actual battlefield where they fought. Doesn't look like a battlefield, but it is apparently. And I don't know if you know this or not, but there was actually this is true about this. There was actually a second battle. Those people know it. Second battle of Thermopylae. Have you heard about that one? There was a second one. There was. It was like the Nazis, Nazi Germany, I think, versus I think it was the Greeks, the modern Greeks, Greek Republic or whatever it was, or maybe it was a monarchy at the time. They got crushed. That one didn't go well, that battle. So anyway, so yeah, that's basically what happened with Thermopylae. Now, so they do have another battle later that, of course, you hear about, which is very famous. That, of course, is the one called Salamis, which probably ends up being more important later in history overall. What happened was the Greeks evacuated their forces in the south, like in what is basically Boeotia in Attica, and they evacuated to an island off the coast of Greece called Salamis, which is in the Saronic Gulf. I do have a map I can show you to expand up here, but you can see it right here. It's right there, kind of close to the Isthmus of Corinth. Isthmus of Corinth is right here between Attica and the Peloponnesian peninsulas. So it's right here. And so the Persian fleet came around right here, and they were just going to, I guess, annihilate whatever people and forces that were there, and wipe out the Greek navy. And that would have been probably it overall. But the Greeks had this naval commander that was pretty good, named Themistocles. Yeah, Themistocles, of course, very famous. He was a Greek politician and also famous general of theirs, strategos. And he was able to amass a huge fleet of several hundred Greek warships, which Greek warships, by the way, if you know about it, are called triremes. Themistocles, what he did was he maneuvered the Greek navy into the Strait of Salamis, which is kind of a narrow strait, kind of like Thermopylae. It's kind of like the naval version of Thermopylae, except the Greeks won. Anyway, the Greeks, they think they had, it kind of varies on the amount they had. It's kind of different theories on that, how they actually have it. Maybe 370 warships, possibly, that they had total. Persians had basically almost like 3-4 times that, 1,200 warships. They think the Greeks had better naval vessels. The famous trireme, if you know about it, was a type of naval vessel that they were known for. These were types of galley ships where they used like 3 decks of oars, powered by oars with sails. And, triremes use these bronze rams that they put on the front, which they would ram ships with them. They can sink them below the waterline. And so the idea was to basically either sink ships, or also, I guess the other thing they would do is try to come alongside and seize their ships, like, board them or whatever. Here's a picture of like what a trireme looks like. Kind of got one right here, you can see. But they think the trireme was something that was evolved from the Phoenicians a long time ago, the so-called bireme, which had 2 decks of oars instead of 3 like this one does. I think the Romans had the quinquereme, which I think had 4 decks, of oars. That's a typical type of warship that was like wooden mostly, of course. And so they're very good maneuverable ships in battle. And so they actually would end up sinking, like, I forget the number, but somewhere between like 200-300 Persian ships were actually sunk in the battle. That's pretty good. And it was a decisive battle of the whole second invasion. It forced Xerxes to kind of give up on the invasion and go home. Although he did leave one of his best generals behind named Mardonius to try to see if he could maybe invade the Peloponnese Peninsula and conquer it, which they failed later. But they think that was the bulk of like the whole wars, and it started it led to the decline of really the invasions by Persia and all that. Yeah, they had one more battle I did want to mention. They had one called the Battle of Plataea. That's like one of the big Spartan battles they always talk about also as well. And Mardonius' forces was going to try to march into the Peloponnese, but they have to first reach the Isthmus of Corinth. But they only got to the city-state of Plataea, which is near the Isthmus of Corinth. And Sparta, Corinth, and Athens were able to bring up a huge force to counter basically Mardonius' forces, and they were annihilated. They annihilated their forces, and Mardonius was actually killed in the battle. And so Spartans' big two battles, in history are basically the Battle of Thermopylae and, of course, the Battle of Plataea. That's the ones they're mostly known for fighting in. But Plataea might be their best military victory I think they had, because Thermopylae they actually kind of lost because they all got killed. But anyway, so like I said, the Persians never really threatened again, like the Greek homeland or Greek mainland itself, but they are going to try to come back. They'll try to, I think they have like other attempts to invade, which fail. They do try to hold on to the Aegean basin, but the Greeks counter and try to, push them out of the Aegean. Alexander the Great, at the end of the 4th century in the 330s BC, is going to also invade Persia, will continue the wars. He'll be more successful. He'll eventually, defeat them and conquer the Persian Empire. And that'll bring on the so-called Hellenistic Age. That'll be, of course, later. So that's basically the bulk of the Persian Wars. But like I said, they go down to 450 BC. And I did want to move on, and I did want to talk about a new period, of course, in Greek history. It's kind of like comes on the heels of the so-called greco-persian wars that were fought at the time. You do have the age of Pericles that they had, of course, that kind of follows next. It's part of the golden age of Greece or golden age of Athens that they call it in history. And it's a period where about 31, 32 years that Pericles kind of dominates Athens in Greece. I'll get to him later, but I think I mentioned him before. Pericles was a famous Athenian politician. He's also a general as well. He kind of forms the Athenians and other Greek states into like a vast empire that will kind of control the Aegean basin. And it does have a nickname. They later call it the so-called Athenian Empire. It's usually the name that it's called. They're kind of dominant for about 50 years, that they dominate the region of the Aegean until they're broken, about this, by the Peloponnesian War. And they believe that the Athenian Empire formed out of this thing called the Delian League. What was that? The Delian League was this alliance of Greek city-states, which had as many as 150 to 200-300 that were in it at one point, which were formed to try to defend Greece in case it got attacked again, because they believed that Xerxes and some of these other Persian kings were going to come back again and fight. And so that's why it was formed. It was formed by Cimon, who was, by the way, a famous Athenian politician in general that fought in, I think, the Battle of Salamis and all that. And he was the son of Miltiades, who had fought at Marathon and all that. He formed the initial alliance after Salamis. And why they call it Delian League? It was called that because of the fact that they held the treasury on the island of Delos, which is in the Cyclades Islands, which are in the Aegean. Delos. And Delos was they had a famous temple there, the Temple of Apollo, and it's where supposedly the birthplace of Apollo was, the god of sun and light, and prophecy as well. And they would meet there, and also the members of the Delian League would send money to the treasury that was kept there, or they would send like men and ships to fight in the alliance, to fight, of course, against the Persians. Well, Pericles, if you know about this, who eventually came to power in the mid 5th century, took it upon himself to take control of the league. And if you know what happened, he took the league, he took the money also as well, of course, which he would. Of course, Pericles would kind of be in power, like I said, 31, 32 years roughly. You can see he was very wise. He was very pro-democratic. He would try to expand, Athenian democracy, especially to the lower classes, like the Thets, which were the landless peasant farmers, I guess. And so what he's going to do, he's going to take the money from the Delian League, the treasury, he moves it to Athens, and they put it in the Parthenon, because the Parthenon, you know about that, acted as a bank. So if you wanted to, put money away, you could go to the Parthenon, they would hold your money for you. And so he would take that money and he would start expanding their military, their naval force. He used it to reconstruct the Parthenon and the Acropolis behind me. And then on top of that, Pericles even went further, and he began to glorify Athens. He started spending a lot of money on art, culture, sculptors. Sculpture, like if you know about it, he backed a lot of sculptors, things like that, to build like artwork and stuff like that. And he rebuilt pretty much the Acropolis, all the temples that kind of we talked about, like the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena Nike, and other temples were rebuilt under Pericles' rule. Parthenon, of course, became the most famous. Of course, I told you that he would rebuild, which was built to honor the goddess Athena, who was their main patron, of course, the namesake of the city of Athens. But it was also built as a war memorial. It was built actually to honor the dead that had died in, I guess, the second invasion during the Persian Wars. And I told you before about the Parthenon, that it became a major symbol of classical Greek architecture, the Greek culture of that time. And of course, I think I told you that it's also controversial because, the fact that they're trying to maybe rebuild part of it, and parts of it, it's not there. I told you about all the friezes that are at the top above the columns, which half of them are in Britain and the other half are in Greece. And so I think they still are. I don't think they've been pretty much released back to them and all that. Oh, yeah, these are the other temples that he also built. Yeah, of course, the Temple of Athena Nike, you may have heard of. The Rectheon also, which was built to honor Athena and Poseidon, of course. He also built that one as well. So all those were constructed under him. He was good friends with Phidias. I don't know if you've heard of Phidias. Phidias was a famous Greek sculptor at the time and all that. He's the one who built the famous statue of Zeus, which was in the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. So he was big patron of Greek artists and so on. Is something that Pericles was very famous for. So Athenians weren't just about war. Like I said, they were about culture in general and things like that as well. However, Pericles would eventually die in 429. And so they think he died of some kind of disease, like plague that broke out at Athens, which are not sure what it was. Some people claim bubonic plague may have been the plague, maybe. And they think that the plague may have caused the downfall of Athens as a state. It started declining afterwards. And there was the so-called Peloponnesian War that came in after around 431 to 404 BC. They think that that's kind of blamed as part of why Greece also declined as well. And their naval power just wasn't as good as it was before. So I'll talk a few minutes about the Peloponnesian War today, mention about that and how that kind of broke the back of basically Athens and what was basically the peak period of the Greek city-states in the Golden Age. So where do we get our information about the Peloponnesian War in general? Well, the Peloponnesian War was a war which was told by Thucydides. Thucydides was this Greek historian that was actually a general that fought in the war. And so he kind of knew about what happened, and he used actual real sources from eyewitness accounts and things like that. And so Thucydides is often considered to be the so-called father of scientific history, as you see, where historians use research, which they do today, and all of that, and so he's the father of that. And of course, his book is usually called The History of the Peloponnesian War, is usually what they call it. So usually Herodotus and Thucydides are considered like the two fathers of his history in general. What was it? Well, it was a series of wars where what happened was the Spartans and the Athenians got into a war against each other. It was kind of like a civil war between city-states. You've got a slide showing you kind of what happened. But those two, the intense rivalry between them eventually caused a massive war where just about every city-state was kind of involved in it at one point. Of course, you can see the Spartans had the more superior army, which they did. Of course, the Athenians had more of a superior navy. So you got it's like the Napoleonic era, with Napoleon's armies versus the British with the British Navy. It's kind of like, that's a good comparison, in modern times. I can kind of give you being similar to it. And what happened was they were involved in two opposing alliances that they had. You had the Delian League, which were mostly composed of Ionian states that were in it. And you had the Peloponnesian League that you had as well, which were mostly in the Peloponnese. And I think some in Boeotia were also involved in it as well. I do got a map showing the states that were kind of involved in it. You can see here, I kind of blow it up for you to see, but you can see here that most of the states that were in the so-called Peloponnesian League were in the green areas. So like Sparta, Corinth, of course, Thebes, or I guess Olympia were also in it as well. I think Argos. Then the states you can see that were like Athens, of course, primarily Eboa. You got Athens and Eboa. Eboa is an island above Attica. Thessaly in the north also as well. And all these Ionian states that are through the Aegean, you can see. Thrace, Aeolia, Ionia, those are all were basically in the war as well. So you can see the Athenian Empire was pretty much stretching throughout the Aegean, which was part of also a lot of their economic trade routes that they had. So that's kind of showing you basically, where they mostly fought. Why did the Athenians lose? Well, their navy got crushed eventually, is what happened. Their navy got crushed. What happened was there was this expedition that the Athenians decided to take, which was called the Syracuse expedition, which Syracuse was an ally of the Spartans on Sicily. And it was a disaster. Their fleet got wiped out. And with help from the Persians, which is true about this, the Spartans were able to build a naval force. And so from there, they were able to kind of crush whatever Athenian navy that was left after that. And so pretty much that was it. The Athenian army was pretty much gone, and they were laid siege to. And so it eventually led to their defeat around 404. You can see how bad it got too. I don't know if you can see it in the map there, but at one point, the Athenians even built a wall to block the advancements of Sparta, which is right here. And where the Isthmus of Corinth is, trying to stop them. But in the end, it was just too much. And so results you can see of the whole war was that pretty much the Athenian dominance would come to an end overall. Now, who would end up coming out on top, after the so-called, Peloponnesian War would come to an end? Well, what happened was they had Thebes and Sparta would kind of rise to power afterwards as the two rival powers that would kind of replace Athens there. They would fight it out too, which is true about it as well. They actually, of course, fight their own war, which was later called the so-called Theban-Spartan War, which happened in the mid 4th century BC. And the Thebans and Boeotians above Attica would fight against the Spartans. And actually, the Spartans lost. That's something that's kind of most people don't know about. But the Spartans were beaten badly at the Battle of Leuctra in 371, July 371 BC. And part of why they lost, if you know about this, was the Thebans used this military tactic called the oblique order, where they did this flank attack on one side, crushed their forces. And so it led to Thebes kind of becoming the big power afterwards, which is true about that. However, what's going to happen later is that you'll have the rise of Macedonia, which is going to come in. Macedonia, which is in the north, which you can see up here in this map. They're going to come, of course, next, and they're going to, take over Greece. Is what's going to occur. You'll see, King Philip II, Alexander the Great, those, of course, famous Macedonian kings. They'll take over Greece, take control of the sphere of influence in that region and also the Aegean. And then, of course, as you know, Alexander is going to point his forces eastward into Turkey, where the Persian Empire is, and conquer them as well. And so you do have a brief period where the Macedonians kind of control the Greek world, or so-called Hellenistic age, which, of course, I'll get into, of course, later. So that pretty much ends my history of course, ancient Greece, at least the major parts of Greek history that I'll have. I think what I'm going to, of course, be doing later next week, I'm going to kind of move on. I'm going to talk about, I'm still going to be on Greece, of course, but I will get into the classical age, like the history of Greek culture. So I'll get into that next week. I think I'm going to talk about the Olympics is one of the first things I'll kind of talk about, I know, next week, and get into the gods and the philosophers of Greece. I guess I'll talk about the Greek famous playwrights. They were well known. Then I will get into, and I will talk about, of course, the Alexander the Great and the conquest of Persia. That'll be, of course, the other thing that we'll have coming up as well. So that'll be another 2 lectures next week on that. And then, of course, after that, I'll move on to the Romans. We'll get to that next as well. But before I go, I did want to remind you, don't forget, you do have 2 assignments, of course, that are, coming up, eventually due. Second vocab due Friday, of course. And then, of course, you've got the China quiz that you have. Of course, that's due this week, I think. Well, that's due next week, actually. Next, I want to say Wednesday, Thursday next week, likely is what it'll probably do. So make sure you start wrapping up those later overall. If you have any questions, comments, of course, about my lecture, let me know. I don't think we had any comments, questions, I guess, now today overall. But I know a lot of you, of course, will have some later for me or past, questions about other lectures, more or less. So y'all have a great week coming up, the rest of the week and weekend, of course, and I'll see y'all, of course, next week. So y'all take care, of course, have a great weekend coming up.